Good morning, everyone. Craig Chamberlain with the Wisdom Worth Knowing podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today is Saturday, February 12th, 5:59 a.m. So close to 6 a.m. But we're starting right on time today. Today's video, we are going to talk about how the subject basically you guys picked from yesterday was courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not absence of fear. This is a quote from Mark Twain. I'm going to say it again. Courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not absence of fear. So we're going to unpack that today and go into greater detail and have a discussion time. And we're going to wrap it all up at the end with the devotion. So let's go ahead and move on to Audible. If you're like me and you love reading, or even the idea of reading, but don't have that time because you have a spouse, kids, full-time job, and crazy time-consuming hobbies, then I have good news for you. With Audible, listening is the new reading. You can pop in your earbuds and play that next exciting adventure, or expend your knowledge right from your Android or Apple device. And now, for a limited time, you can get your first audiobook completely free. Just visit audible.wisdomworthknowing.org right now and take advantage of a free 30-day trial. More than enough time to finish that first book. If you are dissatisfied for any reason, you can cancel anytime. Remember, audible.wisdomworthknowing.org. So we've expanded the live stream a little bit. I went through quite a few settings yesterday, and I'm still overcoming technical difficulties. I'm hoping we fixed the audio levels issue from yesterday, because I was listening to my AirPods. I'm like, no matter how loud I turn this up, I cannot hear me, or I can barely hear me. Obviously a problem when you have a podcast. People need to be able to hear you. So give me feedback if you run into any technical issues. During the live stream, you can obviously leave your comments. Just go to wisdomworthknowing.org. It'll bring you to the Facebook page. You can watch the live stream and leave comments as we're streaming. But we have expanded the streaming, and I have no idea how it's going to turn out yet, but it's expanded to YouTube, so you can subscribe on YouTube. And we've also expanded to Rumble. So for now, hopefully that's running well. I'm actually going to pull that up real quick on my end just to see if it's running. I have no idea. We are going to find out. Well, I'll wait till later. I'll find out if it worked later. That's what I'm going to do. Don't want to waste your guys' time with that. All right, so let's get started on today's topic. So courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not absence of fear. Yeah, and I apologize for my dog barking, by the way, this morning. It's like you can have, I was talking to myself, I was like, you can have your own private studio and you set up in your room, which it took me a long time to set up. You could wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning to make sure you never get interrupted. And then, lo and behold, 3 rooms over, you still have your dog finding a way, or your kids or your family finding a way to get audio in the background. So, hey man, we don't have a actual studio here, so this is as good as we get. We'll take what we can get. So we've talked about worry in a previous podcast. It's actually it's a cornerstone subject for me because I grew up with anxiety and anxiety disorder, the generalized anxiety disorder. Did the whole panic attack thing and all that. And it's taken me years to kind of learn to live with it. First of all, just accept that that's part of my personality. And then even moving beyond that, just developing the tools necessary to actually learn to cope with a highly anxious personality type. This quote is really cool. It is from Mark Twain. I'm not entirely sure specifically where Mark Twain said it. It is a quote from the Facebook page Remarkable Books, so I want to give a shout out to them. They are a good page. You'll probably want to follow them. But let's start with that first part. Courage is resistance to fear. So resistance is like the state of when something pushes on you, you push back. So let's say if I have like 2 objects and they are pushing at each other, and one of those objects is capable of pushing back harder than the other. So as one pushes, let's say person A or object A pushes towards object B with a certain amount of force, and then that level of force overcomes the resistance, and it just slowly pushes it back. So it's not like suddenly it just collapses and falls over unless it's got no resistance. But resistance is actually something that is kind of intrinsic to the object. So there's a level of resistance each object would have. We could say, if we're just talking about traditional objects that sit on the floor of something, you could say it's just the morning. I'm sorry, not just the morning. You could say it's just the weight of the object. So the heavier an object is, the more resistance it has, and the harder it is to push. So courage as the resistance to fear is something that is determined by how hard we push back against the things that give us anxiety. So the reason that's important to kind of take into consideration is because when you don't actually take the time to develop the resistance, then anytime something scary kind of comes along or triggers your anxieties, it's going to instantly just you're just going to flop over. It's going to overtake you. It's just going to plow through you. And so this idea of developing resistance doesn't make fear go away. It's just saying, okay, fear is going to come regardless, but we are going to take the time necessary to develop the skills, and in some ways we are limited because there's also some resistance that's just built on experience. But we're going to develop the skills in order to increase our level of resistance to fear. There's a number of ways we can do that, but I'm going to move into that after this because it's also related to the second part of this phrase, which is the mastery of fear. So we can develop our resistance, and then we can develop our mastery. To me, mastery is when you finally gotten to the point of you're no longer resisting, just resisting, I should say, but you are pushing back even. And so if you've got this inertia level going where you're constantly already being pushed around by your anxieties and fear, you need to first start developing that resistance to the fear so that you can just slow the momentum, right? Think of a car in motion. When you hit the brakes, it doesn't stop instantly. At least I hope it doesn't. You'll fly out the window. But when you begin to stop the car, you just slow down gradually at first. And then finally you come to a stop. But let's say there's a second car pushing at you. I know it sounds weird, but as you slow down, you want that second car to start pushing back. And so that was where the mastery takes place. It's like, okay, first we got to learn to stop the car. Then we actually need to develop the ability to actually not only stop it, but push back. And then obviously the last part of the actual saying is it's not the absence of fear. This is something that I definitely know is related to the naivety of youth. I'm 37, so when I was in my early 20s and I really struggled with this whole anxiety thing, I just assumed anxiety should not exist. You know, I had this idea that just this fundamental denial of reality, that something was wrong with me because I was anxious. Hang on one second. Hope you're having coffee with me this morning. But I had this general idea that not only should I be able to resist fear, but fear shouldn't exist. I should be fearless. I actually hate that word, by the way, fearless. I absolutely despise it because I don't think there is such a thing as fearless. I don't think people are fearless. I think people learn to cultivate and develop the skills necessary to manage their fear. And I think some people have it becomes so intrinsic because they develop the skill so well that they eventually just unconsciously resist the anxieties as they flow through them. And I know people like this. I know people who are just fundamentally untouchable with anxiety and fear. And I am not one such person. I've gotten better at it, but I am not the kind of person who magically adapts well to changing circumstances and changing situations. So let's talk a little bit how we can actually develop this resistance and then mastery of fear. Everybody's different, so everybody's skill set is going to be unique in how they deal with their anxieties. But in my experience, what a lot of what happens is it begins in my mind. All right, so there's a couple of great books on this. There's one called Battlefield of the Mind. There's one called An Unquiet Mind. There's another one called I'm going to make sure I get this right. From Panic to Power. It's a great one. That one was actually recommended to me by my mom. Let's see here. I'm trying to think if there's any other books off the top of my head. Obviously, devotionals help. We read The Utmost for His Highest on our morning podcast, and that usually helps because I think maintaining inner monologue and inner communication and having a healthy prayer life is essential to dealing with, and even if you're not religious, just having a healthy dialogue life, either with yourself or with what you would call your higher power, is extremely important. I obviously have my own views on my own higher power, but that's not my responsibility to. I should respect everybody's perspective on that. But just that inner dialogue is extremely important. But check out those books; they're fantastic, especially if you are in a panic situation. But it really starts with the mind. It starts in your head, and there is a word that's on the internet that is quite hilarious. It's called being triggered. It's like, I'm triggered. I've been triggered. But there's truth to that. We do have triggers. It's not as simple as it sounds. We can all sit back and go, yeah, I can handle anything that comes my way. But then there's always that certain set of circumstances that when something happens, let's say for me, it's like, generally it's a health issue. Let's say I get a heart palpitation, right? Because that's actually a pretty common thing. It's just your heart skips a beat. That for me is a trigger. And so that particular trigger will cause me to, freak out. It gets me on the hamster wheel, I like to say. So that starts in my head, though, because I do have a physical thing happening to me, but then my head links it to the physical event, and then that's when the panic sets in, and then I start feeding the fear, and I get on the hamster wheel, and then I just start running faster and faster and faster. So identifying our triggers, because being triggered is a real thing, identifying our triggers is extremely, if not the cornerstone of this process of learning to resist our fears initially. Some of us have never even started to cultivate these tools, and that's totally fine. You were just never given the emotional tools to deal with these triggers, and there's a wide reason that might happen. Culturally, there's a very motivated group of people, in the media, for example, who they make a lot of money on these anxieties and fears. And so they have a vested interest in continuing to kind of pour gas on the fire. And so if you're not aware of what your triggers are and the potential risk for them, you can really get trapped without even realizing it, that you're getting trapped in this loop. And so it's something you need to start identifying at some point. It doesn't matter what age you are, you can start at any point in time. You can say, okay, this is obviously a trigger for me because I've been freaking out for the last 3 days about it. And then a really good way to identify whether it's just anxiety or not is this a real threat? When you're freaking out about something, you ask yourself, is this a real threat? Or is this a perceived threat? These are extremely different things. A real threat is when something is actually happening and occurring. So in other words, you can walk up to somebody and you can point at it and you can say, look at that. That is tragic. How am I going to deal with that? It's actually a real event. A perceived threat is you look at a situation or whatever's going on and then you say, oh my gosh, this is what's going to happen. And we like to think we know what's going to happen. and even if we have a good amount of experience, we can, in a lot of ways, think we know what's going to happen. Having some foresight is obviously good. But in most cases, we don't actually know what's going to happen. And so part of being on the hamster wheel is acknowledging the fact that, or having the level of humility necessary to say, listen, I know this is what I think is going to happen, but there's also a pretty, even if it's a small chance, there is a chance that it's not going to happen. And I'm sure a lot of you may have heard this saying, is some 99 out of the 100 things I worry about don't actually come to be. But then the one thing that I worried about does actually come to be is enough to justify the 100 that I worried about. You know, it's like we have that confirmation bias when it comes to anxiety. It's like we can worry about 100 things, but then if only one of them comes true, we're like, see, I told you. I knew it. I knew this was going to happen. And I do it all the time. Like, it's in my head. Even though it's like even though it was, the problem is I wasted so much time and energy on the 100 that it's ridiculous to assume that just because I was right once that I'm right all the time. Because really at the end of the day we have to admit that anxiety doesn't actually change a problem. It doesn't actually fix a problem. Like, worrying about the problem doesn't fix it. Like, if my house is on fire, this is just an obvious example. My house is burning down. Like, if it's literally burning down, and I stare at it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, everything's going to burn. Does that stop the house from burning down? The fallacy of anxiety is we think that if we just worry a little bit harder, it will change it. So it's like, if I just worry a little bit more about all my stuff burning down, the fire will go away. And it's like, that's not how it works. You know what I mean? Like, in order to put out the fire, which is obviously a real physical thing happening, that's the difference between perceived threat and actual threat, I have to call a fire department. My worry isn't going to stop it from burning down, or I have to go get a fire hose or a bucket. The worry itself doesn't solve the problem. Anxiety is something that is gifted to us so that we can handle threats, not so that we can be crippled by them. And it's a misalignment of our anxiety system when we start using the anxiety to prevent or stop problems, because that's not really why anxiety exists and fear exists. It exists so that we can actually acknowledge that there's a problem and have compassion and empathy for the problem, and then react and actually do something, like calling a fire department, for example. But then at that point, the anxiety has served its purpose, and we're supposed to just say, okay, well, I've done what I can do to resolve this issue or deal with this issue, and now it's time to move on, or focus on something else. So identifying our triggers is extremely important for that resistance part. So Battlefield of the Mind is a perfect example of a book that kind of helps give you emotional tools. So is Panic to Power. Both of those books kind of give you some emotional tools as a framework of starting not only identify those triggers, but then actually dealing with and pushing back on them. And then what I've noticed is from my mid-20s to now my mid-30s, it's taken a decade of panic attacks and worry, but the amount of anxiety, my resistance is better than it was. And that's really all that we need to aim for, is some progress there. We're not going to be perfect. So our goal is to develop over time skills, and only we can do this. Like, we know ourselves better than anybody else. But the goal is to develop skills to begin pushing back on that. So the second part is mastery. And of course, mastery comes later. You know, after you've really mastered your triggers, and again, that will take an immense amount of time, and I don't think we'll ever fully master all of them. I think there will always be new triggers that develop. Then you can actually start to figure out ways of not only saying, how do I deal with this issue? Then we can actually move on and say, how can I use this issue to empower myself? who else can I help? How can I step outside of my anxiety and then actually expand it into power? I think that's why I like that Panic to Power book, because that moves into the mastery portion. That's where you're pushing back. It's where you've stopped just resisting anxieties and you've started to actually push back and mastered them. And then you're the person when the people call when a tragedy happens, because they're like, wow, I saw how person XYZ reacted to this situation. And I need that. I need that strength. And that's a noble goal to aim for. Peterson talks about this. Be the guy who has the courage to give the speech at the funeral, not the one who falls apart. That's a big deal. Like being able to be strong amidst chaos is not an easy thing to do. Being able to pull yourself together and not fake it. Be genuinely strong. And that's a noble pursuit, and it takes an immense amount of self-awareness and understanding and self-mastery to be able to acknowledge the reality of a situation for what it is, and not only acknowledge it, but then actually be a rock or a strength in that. So I think I'm going to close with that. At least this part of the discussion, this part of the featured topic. We're going to move into the discussion time here shortly. Discussion time is actually part of the live stream. I do monitor the chat while I'm live. I don't think I'm going to do the scheduled events again this time, because I've noticed that the actual exposure we're getting on Facebook for this, using this streaming app, it's not as good. I don't think the people on the page are actually seeing this like they did the previous ones. Can you give me feedback on that? Because I don't want people to have to go hunting for it. It should just pop up and say that this person's gone live. You should be able to jump in. But then again, it is a Saturday morning at 6:15. So naturally, most normal humans aren't up this early, let alone on Facebook, let alone looking for a live stream that's 30 minutes to 40 minutes long to participate in. So you can always post your questions in advance for tomorrow's discussion as well. But I do monitor the chat while the video is live, so that I can actually answer any questions you might have. But it doesn't look like there's much discussion going on this morning, and that's totally fine. I do like to go into the discussion time just in case there is something that kind of triggers somebody, not an anxiety way, but so that makes them think that then they have to share it so that we can actually discuss it a little bit more. Let me pull it up here. Give me one moment. Please stand by. Yeah, it looks like it's a lot harder to find it on this new setup. There it is. I see it. Okay. Yeah. I got a comment from my mother. Hello, Becky. I mean, Mom. Hi, Mom. But yeah, we've had a couple regulars on here. Like, we're just getting started and, overcoming all the technical issues. So I'm not super discouraged by that, not having a lot of input on the live stream side just yet. So feel free to join anytime. If you join on the Facebook page, you'll have a lot of opportunities to kind of participate. And like I said, it's also on YouTube and I think Rumble. I'll find that out later. And we'll move on from there. So before we move on to the devotional time, don't forget to subscribe on Facebook. You don't have to do it while you're live. The subscriptions on Facebook is only $1 a month. You're going to get to watch all the episodes whether you subscribe or not. But the subscriptions actually will help fund the advertising and promotion of the show. And the great thing about it is, like I said, $1 a month, it's 4 quarters. It's less than a cup of coffee. So I was kind of going for something super cheap. I didn't want to make it kind of hit people's pocketbooks because I understand. And that'll help the show grow. So consider doing that. Just go to subscribe.wisdomworthknowing.org or just go to wisdomworthknowing.org, which will take you to the Facebook page, and then click that subscribe button and sign up. And you'll get the super cool subscriber badge and on the side of all of your comments on all the posts, not just the live stream, to show